Welcome back into the channel for another episode of Friday Fades. I think this is like episode 5 now that I've done here. I should really double check that. That's 2 weeks in a row now that I'm not really sure what episode we're on, but if you've been around here for a while, you know the drill by now. Every week we take a couple players off the draft board that I would like to peel back our approach on just a little bit. It's not that I think that these players will be busts or won't live up to expectations, but I think there's better value to be had elsewhere on draft day. So let's not waste any time before we get into today's video. We're going to get straight into things here and try and make this a relatively quick Friday episode for you all, as we've got that mock draft coming out tomorrow morning on Saturday. So let's hit that intro and get right in to our two players. All right, before we get too far into things, I'm going to clarify once again, because these two players are being drafted pretty high right now. These are not busts. I am not saying that the two big name wide receivers in today's video are going to be busts for the 2021 fantasy season, but there are other names I would rather have on my team at the same draft position where I can take these two players. So with that being said, obviously you see him up on the screen here. Tyreek Hill is the first person I would like to fade for this week. You know, we've been going all over the place the last couple weeks. We've been touching on some tight ends I want to fade. We've been talking about running backs. Today we've got two big name wideouts. So Tyreek Hill right now is being taken as the wide receiver 1 off of draft boards, and his ADP has pretty much risen the last couple weeks here as the longer Davante Adams has been going through the aftermath of this Aaron Rodgers holdout, the farther his ADP is trending down the board. We're not seeing Adams being taken as a solidified first-round pick anymore, and he's going at the back end of the first, oftentimes even the top of the second round, because obviously without having the MVP of the league last season, it's a lot more of a questionable fantasy situation. So that's causing Tyreek Hill's ADP to be bumped up a little bit, whereas they kind of switched places, and Hill was previously that number 2 wideout on the board, going as that fringe first-round pick. So Tyreek being picked that 8.7 overall draft pick right now on Super Fantasy, it's plain and simple comes down to the fact that I just think that there's other options on the board that are better, and there's options at the wide receiver position in particular, because it's such a deep position group, that can give you the same production just a few picks later. Let's look at his 2020 season. He had some pretty inflated numbers, if we're being honest, in the touchdown department, as did Davante Adams. All the reason that these two players both, and especially Adams, with the fact that he has this quarterback drama, or whatever you want to call it, that we can feel comfortable waiting for other names to fall down the board to us that aren't Tyreek Hill or Davante. So Tyreek Hill had 15, and actually what should have been 16 touchdown receptions last year. Davante Adams had 18. Davante's been one of the most consistent touchdown producers over the last 5 fantasy seasons, but touchdowns in general is not something I like to predict as a strength of your fantasy production volume season in and season out. And for Tyreek Hill, a player who's a bit smaller, his game is more predicated around speed, the deep ball, getting open and having explosive plays. It's a very high touchdown count, and it's not something that I feel great saying that he'll have another high teen touchdown performance this year. The reason I say he should have had 16 touchdowns last year was that Pat Mahomes threw him a bomb last season that he kind of juggled around and like bounced off the defensive back's head or something. I forget exactly how it happened, but I remember seeing the replay over and over again. The ball never touched the ground. It was a clean touchdown reception, and Tyreek himself literally didn't even realize it was a score. They didn't review the play, and they just moved on as if nothing happened. So it wasn't like a 5-yard touchdown pass either. We're talking like a 30, 40-plus yard touchdown bomb that was not factored into his fantasy equation. So, like, significant production. This could have caught him up and had him even closer, nipping at the heels of Davante Adams. I don't know if it quite would have put him over the top as the wide receiver 1 last season, but you get the point here. So, Tyreek Hill is awesome. We all know that. I'm probably comfortable saying he is going to be a top 3 fantasy wide receiver, and I think his floor rather is top 5. Like, this is a player we know is going to produce that good of a ceiling and that good of a floor. maybe the wide receiver position as a whole doesn't quite see the heights that it did last year because the numbers were pretty dang great. But, as the league trends to more passing for every team as the quarterbacks get better, I think that it's safe to assume the position will at least maintain the level of production it had last year. Nonetheless, Tyreek Hill might not exceed his production for himself individually that he had last year. So in the terms that, again, that touchdown production, he did have a lot of yardage. I think that he will at least be able to maintain and possibly improve upon that statistical category. But let's look at some other names here in the early, mid, and late second round. You've got guys like Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, Davante Adams going after him. Obviously, I've talked a little bit about him already in this episode, but those guys could all legitimately finish as the wide receiver one. And you could say the same exact thing about the running back position group, but I think that there's a larger list of names at the wide receiver crop that are going a handful of picks after Tyreek Hill that can all give us that number one overall wide receiver value. I mean, 1,500 yards for Diggs last season. He was the wide receiver 3. He's got the ceiling to get there. He only had 7 touchdown receptions to Tyreek Hill 15. Should have had 16. He could get there this year. He saw 168 targets. That's wildly ahead of what Tyreek Hill saw. And again, just seeing a simple production increase in the touchdown department and projecting that for those type of players is the difference that we see in fantasy outputs. Look at your DeAndre Hopkins. He had 1,400 yards receiving, but he only had 6 reception touchdowns in his first year with Kyler Murray. So again, another player who also had 160 targets last season. The difference here between these players is coming down to one factor. They're all explosive. They all do awesome things in the route running department. They're all very productive players in the receiving yardage department. It comes down to the touchdown level. And touchdowns usually, when you're a player like Tyreek Hill, will regress from the previous season when you've had that monster of a year. It's just hard to sustain that level of production. You look at these other guys on the lower end of things, Davante Adams excluded. Maybe they see an increase in production in that category and elevate themselves above the rest of the pack. So Tyreek Hill might certainly be the safest pick at the position right now. I would say he still is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 for this fantasy season. But in terms of me taking him in just prior to, I would say, the late tier of the first round, your back quarter, the picks 9 through 12 are probably more of what I would consider to be a late first-round pick. That 8.7 overall pick, it's hovering right in between the middle to the late first. So regardless, though, I just don't like picking him quite as much in that territory. He's not even my favorite Chiefs pass-catching option to take in the first round. I would much rather take a Travis Kelce, and maybe Travis Kelce's ADP is more respectable as a late first-round pick, but the positional upside and the positional advantage you get is still that much better by investing into a tight end as it would be as compared to Tyreek Hill, who, if you pick Travis Kelce, probably will see a chance for at least one of those other 3 receivers that I listed off. Maybe even a DK Metcalf is the next best available player on the board at that point. But you're going to see one of those people with the ceiling of number 1 overall wide receiver fall back to you with your second pick, whereas it makes you kind of wonder why you would invest into that position group so early in the first place, when I don't think Tyreek is like the example of a Michael Thomas or a Davante Adams a couple years ago, where you see these players having the potential to set themselves apart from the position group by such a significant margin. At this spot, I would much rather have an Ezekiel Elliott, who I just did a ADP battle between him and Aaron Jones the other day. I'd much rather have either of those 2 running backs because I'd set myself up for better positional advantage and give myself a better way to develop my draft board in comparison to taking a receiver here, because the running backs I'd be left at with that next draft spot would be much lesser, in my opinion, than those receivers. So I think you get the point here. It's not that Tyreek Hill's a bad pick. It's not that I don't think he's going to be good this fantasy season. It's simply about roster construction and trying to maximize your output at every individual position, and I think that going elsewhere at this point in time helps you do a better job of doing so. Then the next pick here is A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, and you probably saw this coming if you've been listening to the channel for the past month or so now. Since that Julio Jones trade, I have majorly changed my perception of A.J. Brown for the 2021 season. He was a top 3 receiver for me prior to that trade. After seeing Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith walk out the door, I'm thinking to myself, what is here to stop A.J. Brown from having a 150 target season? Well, now his name is Julio Jones, and he's not going anywhere. Maybe Julio Jones misses some games this season, continues to struggle with some nagging injuries, but I would argue that A.J. Brown and Julio Jones have the exact same ceiling on a per-game basis, considering the fact that they literally have the exact same skill sets. A.J. Brown has modeled his game after Julio Jones, obviously being his idol. And these two players, in the healthy games that Julio played last season for 9 contests, they had the exact same amount of targets per game. So you're looking at nearly identical fantasy football situations for this coming season. And while I will concede A.J. Brown's the younger, healthier pick here, he'll probably suit up for more games. I think they have the same upside as I already stated, and you can get Julio Jones in the 4th round. So this again comes down to the fact that not only do I think there are better positions available on the board to invest into at this particular draft spot where we're taking A.J. Brown in the middle of the 2nd round, I think there's better players at his own position that I would rather have. And for the Titans, who to begin with are a low passing volume offense, they're not throwing the ball all over the yard like some of these teams are that we're seeing in the NFL. I mean, let's face it, Julio Jones had a better fantasy situation as a member of the Falcons, despite having Calvin Ridley there, than he does now with the Titans in maybe a more stable and better organization. But nonetheless, the Titans were bottom 5 in the league in passing attempts per game last season, and there's only so much they can do in terms of the 3 elite mouths they have to feed. And clearly Derrick Henry out of the backfield is going to be leading the charge in that department for this offense. So, at similar or lesser ADP, we've got Justin Jefferson hanging around that territory, Calvin Ridley. I'll take those 2 players any day of the week. A.J. Brown's one of the best, most physically imposing young wideouts in the game. His routes, he's able to separate very, very well. But again, this is situation over talent for me. I've talked about this a lot on the channel, not only this offseason, but in other contexts of videos as well. Sometimes, and I've actually got a video about this on SFS Gold, the exclusive membership package here for the channel. The impact that a team situation has on a fantasy player often trumps a player's talent every single time. And in the video that I recorded is probably last January at this point, so it's been a while since I recorded this video, but it's still up there. I compared Odell Beckham Jr. and Jamison Crowder, and at the time, Jamison Crowder was back-to-back seasons the target leader for the New York Jets. And I said, these 2 players are nearly on the same playing field simply because of the situations they're in. The Browns were a team that Jarvis Landry already had an established role in their offense, and while Odell Beckham Jr. was clearly the more talented player in that offense, Jamison Crowder was getting just as many, if not more, targets per game than him. He was putting up a better level of fantasy output on a per-game basis, and he was producing more wide receiver 1 weeks than Odell Beckham Jr. was on a consistent level because the Jets were a bad team trying to catch up late in games, trailing, and Jamison Crowder reaped the rewards of that. The Browns were leading, conversely, in football games, and this was prior to the ACL injury as well, so maybe it was actually prior to that January date I stated. I should go check when I actually posted that video. But we've seen the Browns front-running in games, running the ball more often than they pass, and as a result, Odell Beckham Jr.'s ceiling in the highest of highs that he has might be better than that of Jamison Crowder, but his lows are far lower than what we were seeing out of Crowder. Now, obviously, heading into 2021, there's a complete different situation. Both teams have addressed other positions in their lineups, and things change, and that's the nature of fantasy football, and we got to be ready to adjust for that. But overall, the message here, to make a long story short, is that you look at a Calvin Ridley who no longer has Julio Jones, who's a major factor in A.J. Brown's fantasy situation. He's no longer around, and he doesn't have to worry about that. And people will bring up Kyle Pitts, and I acknowledge this every time I talk about this situation in general, is that Kyle Pitts is an awesome talent. He's got the raw potential to be one of the all-time greats at the tight end position. But go back the last 5 years and show me a tight end in his rookie season that's put up top 5 fantasy tight end numbers, heck, top 10 fantasy numbers. It just doesn't happen because these guys not only have to get used to separating at an NFL level, they got to block defensive ends that are forces of their own right. I mean, I'm watching 36-year-old Mercedes Lewis, who is known for his blocking capabilities for my Green Bay Packers, trying to pick up Khalil Mack in pass pro and just getting knocked on his butt every time. I mean, I don't want to do the big dog any discredit or any disservice here, but I mean, tight ends do a whole lot more outside of the stat sheet than we don't realize. So it's not like Kyle Pitts is taking plays off when he's not catching passes. Like, he is going to be fighting out there, keeping Matt Ryan clean. And yes, they're going to use Kyle Pitts more as a receiving threat than as a blocking threat. That's common sense. But the point being here, Calvin Ridley saw 143 targets with Julio Jones on the field last season. I'd much rather have him any day with that production and that usage of Jones off the field this coming season. Justin Jefferson, I touched on him. Give me the guy who, in his rookie season, didn't start the first 2 games of the year and then out-targets and out-produces Adam Thielen, a seasoned vet, a proven player. I mean, Justin Jefferson looks like he's got some of the best routes in the league right now. And Kirk Cousins is good enough to give him the ball. The Vikings, in the fourth quarter, if they're losing games, give us some of the best empty-calorie fantasy production there is out there. So there's plenty of other players I would rather take advantage of, and that was just 2 examples of other wide receivers I would rather have. At this spot in the board in the second round, give me an Antonio Gibson. Cam Akers is out of the situation now. That's the next best running back up on the board, in my opinion, as a player who should now see his ADP rise because I think his upside is the next best, and he's the next dark horse player to have a potential top RB finish this year. Najee Harris, probably more valuable of an investment than an A.J. Brown right now at this point in the offseason, because look at the receivers you can get in the third round that have such a safe fantasy floor. So, again, not that A.J. Brown will be a bust this season, not that Tyreek Hill will be a bust this season either, but I think that when we assess the overall difference between players that are going, again, at or around similar ADPs to them, the value that we can take advantage of at other positions or at the same position later on in the board isn't really that different, and it gives us incentive to diversify our picks and go elsewhere on the board. So that'll do it for today's video, and I'll see you guys in the outro. Thank you all so much for jumping by today's video. If you enjoyed, make sure to head down and give this video a like, as well as subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. Remember, we've got our 6th video of the week coming out tomorrow morning on a Saturday, where we're going to be doing another subscriber mock draft. So thank you all so much for tuning in today. Let me know down in the comment section below, do you agree with my takes today? And I totally understand that if some of you are super high on either of these wideouts that you might think I'm crazy, but I truly believe that investing our draft capital into other positions when there is so much depth and ability to pivot at the wideout spot, we don't have to lock in on either of these 2 players, despite the fact that they might have excellent ceilings and whatnot. There are other players that give us that same level of competency at later draft spots and other positions that give us a greater advantage at that group. So, again, thank you all so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.